Hi folks, you're with Tacitus to your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the situation in the 1970s where the Ugandan, that's a country in Africa, where the Ugandan dictator who'd seized power in a coup d'etat, where he decreed the expulsion of Indians from Uganda. Now, depending on whose numbers you look at, the Indian population was somewhere between 65 and 90,000 people. And given the widespread of numbers, it's a bit hard to get a clear fix on it, but it's probably within that range. Now, the Indians were the primary merchant class, business class, that sort of thing. And so they held a disproportionate amount of sway in the country. Now, when Idi Amin seized power, he made a number of sort of observations, and this is sort of illustrative to how things go. And I'll use another example of Fiji shortly, where there was another coup d'etat by the indigenous people of Fiji, again in response to the Indians taking what was seen as a disproportionate amount of power. Now, Idi Amin sort of looked at the Indian population. It was a very small part of the overall Ugandan population, and the comments he made were, well, the Indians come here, they marry each other, other than a tiny fraction, they don't marry into the local population. They still keep their Indian customs and habits. They still dress in Indian clothes. They're still very much Indian. They keep to themselves in a small section of the city. They don't engage in our cultural events or anything like that. They bribe our politicians and they bribe our public servants. And due to their inability to integrate, their lack of desire to integrate, they send back to India for brides and husbands, and so on and so forth. So all the things that Indians still do today and were doing hundreds of years ago, that the Indians don't change their behaviour to suit the circumstances they're in, or if it is, it's a minuscule change, and just to get the people out of their face rather than to actually go along with it. But the through this a lack of desire, I think, to integrate rather than anything, the Indians are more likely to send their children overseas for an education and that sort of stuff. So and very few of the Indians took out local, some did, but very few took out local citizenship. And the ones that did, it was for more tactical reasons than for they wanted to become citizens. So Idi Amin noticed this, as anybody would, by the way. I mean, the fact that he was sort of ultimately a crazy guy doesn't mean that he didn't drink water when he was thirsty. So he observed this, and him with his sort of cronies and advisors decided to expel the Indians that are in Uganda. Now, this had been a simmering issue for a while. It didn't just suddenly boil over when Idi Amin came along. It had been an issue for quite a while, that the Indians held this disproportionate amount of power and the unwillingness to integrate and so on and so forth. Now, whatever the reasons for that are, now the Indian argument was, well, these people are they're much lower than us in the social development and scale of things. So why should we integrate with them? We want to keep our diaspora. And this Indian thing about maintaining genetic purity, which they have today, even interacting with white people, or any other people for that matter. So and I remember, just sort of quick sidebar here, there was an Indian or guy that I knew who I think his father was Indian, his mother was Chinese or Nepalese or something like that, Chinese maybe. And he said he couldn't go to school anywhere because when he was in India, he was bullied. He in his recounting of that story, he was bullied unmercifully by the Indian kids because he was part Chinese. and then I think his father was like in maybe some sort of diplomatic mission post or something like that. Then they moved to, I think it was either Singapore or Malaysia. Singapore, he moved to Singapore, and then he was bullied unmercifully by the Chinese kids because he was part Indian, and so he explained it. He said white people have no idea what racism is. You ought to go to those other places, and that's where you would experience racism. He said, because I was only half Chinese, the Indians gave me a terrible hard time. Because I was half Indian, the Chinese kids gave me a terrible hard time. Well, that was his recounting of it. So anyway, the grievances that the Ugandans had were, they were genuine in some ways, that the Indians effectively controlled the political system through bribery and corruption, and through giving strategic little sort of prestige jobs to African, the offspring of the African sort of tin pot dictator type people. But Idi Amin and his advisors decided, no, if we get rid of these people, then we will have all that benefit. Now, as you can imagine, such a knee-jerk decision didn't work out so well, because there weren't the Africans there to replace them or to do the jobs that the Indians were doing, or that didn't have the expertise. So it as an economic move, it didn't really achieve much. Sure, the black people came in and took over these otherwise successful businesses, but then a lot of the customers that these Indian businesses had were in India. So they lost that business straight away, and then they had to find other customers and other markets, and then it all fell to pieces. So it was a very tight sort of business clique that was really just totally within the Indian diaspora, and this was something that Idi Amin either didn't understand or appreciate, or didn't care about. But just coming back to the idea of now, this is in 1970s time frame in Africa. But if we look at the Indians coming to, say, Australia today, they hang around very much in all Indian suburbs. They will only spend money with other Indian shops unless they've simply got no choice. They'll only use other Indians for services and goods, again, unless they've got no choice. They do an inordinate amount of business with India. They bring out peasants to work in their takeout food shops, and have all sorts of tax and legal wage level evasions on a grand industrial scale. They only intermarry with their own diaspora, and again send back to India for brides and husbands. Even Indians that are born in Australia will send back to India for brides and husbands. They're fanatical about keeping their culture and their genetic purity intact. Fanatical about it, absolutely fanatical. And if any member of the Indian family does decide, local born or even second generation local born, does decide they want to marry outside of the diaspora, or even marry another Indian that's local born, then this is viewed with great hostility by the wider family. And these people, if they want to go down this path or are contemplating it, they're threatened with exclusion from the will, expulsion from the diaspora. All their family will shun them, and this sort of thing if they don't get their husband or bride from India, from the village of the ancestors and all this sort of thing. So now, if you look at Indian businesses, the Brahmin, demigod type businesses, they're all Indians, and they'll maybe have one or two sort of token white flunkies. There'll usually be a sort of a very pale blonde chick on the reception, and maybe one white boy, but they gravitate towards hiring people with red hair and freckles. So even that has to have a novelty value to it. And if you go into an Indian business, you'd be lucky to see a single non-Indian person, let alone non-white. So again, they're keeping the money, and they believe they are entitled to keep the money very much in their diaspora. They want special representation in councils and parliaments, and regional parliaments, federal. They want their own people. We want Indian people in there, people that swear allegiance, on the Hindu book and this. So they very much keep it in the even today, and also the same in Britain or Canada or the United States. So really, the Indian behaviour hasn't changed. Now, coming to Fiji, Fiji has had quite a decent-sized Indian minority population, and the British government back in the day found that the local Fijian people were not inclined to hard work and weren't so very good timekeepers and things like that. So they imported some Indians to work in the plantations. Now the Indians, again, they're more conscientious and industrious than the local Fijians. I don't think anyone disputes that. And they acquired quite a lot of clout in their the fact that they're more prominent as merchants and traders and so on. And so they also bribing local politicians and all sorts of things like that, and they were able to through means that some may say was not above board, were able to acquire majority status in the government. Now, the local Fijians, the indigenous Fijians, didn't think this was a very good idea, and they think the Fiji should still have a majority government made up of Fijians. So they launched, in effect, a coup d'état. I'm not sure you quite position it as that, but the option was that. So they launched a coup d'état to make sure that the Indian government didn't take office or didn't have it for very long, and that the local Fijians would make up the majority in the parliament, and hence would hold the positions of prime minister and president and so on. Now, what were the complaints of the Fijians? And this is again illustrative. This was, I don't know, 20 plus years ago, and the complaints were that the Indians are bribing everybody, to get their own way. They send back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. They only marry each other. They stick together as an entire sections are taken over by Indians, and they don't they've got no intention of integrating with the local culture, and so on and so on. So really exactly the same complaints that Idi Amin had. Now, whether you consider it a complaint or not, if someone were to stop me today, say what's your complaints about the Indian diaspora being mass immigrated to Australia? It's going to get worse, by the way. The Australian government's just signed pretty much what seems to me to be an open-ended arrangement where Indians can come here, en masse to Australia, and the bar is lowered and lowered again and lowered some more. India's got 250 million people under the age of 35. They really want under the age of 30. Actually, they just want to get rid of. They just want to just get. They can't find jobs for them. India's a basket case. They just want to get rid of as many of these people as they can. To places like the United States, Australia, Britain, Canada, and so on. So my complaints today would be the same. If I don't mind if people, well qualified people with skills and leading the economy come to Australia. I got no problem with that at all, none. But they need to have those skills, and also they need to want to integrate. They want to be part of the society, not to form ghettos and take over entire suburbs where you can walk for miles. You see nothing but Indian people, and you see Indian shops everywhere. All you hear is Indian people speaking in their home language. Even people that are, and even Indians that are third, fourth, fifth, sixth generation Western born are still sending back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides. To me, these people do not make good immigrants, regardless of what skills they may or may not have. Now, I understand if you go to a place like Fiji or Africa, the Indians bring their mercantile skills, again, closely tied with India and within the wider family and diaspora. They're not commercially successful outside of that, I would argue. But nonetheless, this idea of an immigrant needs to come to any country, it doesn't matter where, if I go to another country, needs to go to the country, the idea of you're going to integrate into that society and you'll do business equally with all members of that society, not willfully and deliberately and corruptly, in my view, try and keep all the business and the profit and the benefit within your own family or diaspora. So that's something about Idi Amin was crazy, but in that sense, his observations and those of his advisors and people around him are the same observations that anyone would make today. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.